I confronted my dad when I saw him with another woman on a trip. Then refused to keep it a secret. Looking back, I'm not even sure how it all unraveled. One moment, I was feeling that rush of freedom. Finally allowed to go on a weekend trip with my friends, a big deal. Considering my dad's usual strictness about any trip more than a town away. I'd spent weeks convincing him, putting together a case for why this trip was worth it. It was our last summer before senior year. And I had saved up enough to cover most of my own expenses. I thought he was finally giving in because he trusted me. And maybe he did, to some extent. But there was also another reason. 2 days before the trip, he told me he had a business trip scheduled in the same city. So he'd be nearby if I needed anything. He said it casually, as though it were a coincidence. But I saw through it. My dad never left things up to chance. So even though it annoyed me, I accepted that he'd probably check on me while he was there. In the back of my mind, I figured he just wanted to make sure we didn't get up to anything too crazy. The weekend was everything I'd hoped for. We explored the city, ate at cheap diners, and splurged a little on a nicer dinner the last night to celebrate. We'd laughed about memories from the past year, talked about our hopes for senior year, and it felt like we were stepping into a bigger, more exciting world together. I hadn't thought about my family much at all, until that last night. When everything changed. It was supposed to be a relaxing dinner. A final send-off before heading back home. We chose a quiet, dimly lit restaurant. The kind where everyone whispered over their plates of food and the waitstaff carried themselves like they were serving royalty. We were enjoying our dinner when my eye wandered across the room. And suddenly, I froze. There, at a small table in the back, was my dad, and he wasn't alone. The woman sitting with him wasn't my mom. She was much younger, probably in her late 20s, with bright red lipstick and a smile that seemed to shine just for him. Her hand was on his arm, their fingers intertwined, and he was looking at her with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. They looked close, like they were in their own world, laughing quietly, their faces just a little too close. It felt like my stomach dropped to the floor. The scene in front of me seemed surreal. Like something out of a movie where the main character stumbles upon a dark family secret. Part of me wanted to look away, to ignore it and pretend I'd never seen it. But another part of me was rooted to the spot, unable to believe what I was seeing. My dad, the person I'd looked up to my whole life, was with someone who wasn't my mom. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it really was just a business dinner, and I was reading too much into it. But then she laughed, leaning toward him in a way that was far too familiar, her hand lingering on his arm. No one acted like that with a business partner. And his face, he wasn't just being polite or friendly. He looked at her like he was seeing someone he cared about. Maybe even someone he loved. My heart pounded in my chest. And I felt an overwhelming urge to confront him right then and there. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. But anger and betrayal bubbled up inside me, mixing with confusion and shock. How could he do this? How could he betray my mom like this? And in a place where I might see him. No less? Before I could think twice, I stood up, excusing myself from my friends and making my way across the room. My steps were shaky, and every part of me screamed to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was going on. As I approached, I saw the color drain from his face. His eyes widened, flicking between me and the woman at the table. And he looked like he'd seen a ghost. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice steady, but I could feel the tremor in my hands. He fumbled for words, trying to plaster on a forced smile. "Oh, hey, honey, this is just business." His words sounded hollow, even to him. The woman next to him was frozen, her hand still resting on his arm, looking at me with wide eyes. "Really?" I replied, raising an eyebrow. "Because it doesn't look like business." There was a beat of silence as he scrambled for an explanation. I could see his mind racing. But no matter what excuse he tried to pull together, he knew I wouldn't believe it. I wasn't a kid anymore. And I wasn't stupid. This was exactly what it looked like. "This is complicated," he muttered, dropping his gaze, looking anywhere but at me. "You wouldn't understand. You're too young." "Don't say that," I replied, my voice wavering with anger. Don't stand here and pretend like I wouldn't understand. I see what's going on. He looked as though he was about to argue. But instead, he just sighed, casting a quick glance at the woman beside him. The guilt in his eyes was unmistakable. But he didn't offer an apology. Didn't even try to explain himself. Without another word, I turned and walked back to my table, ignoring the stares from nearby diners. My friends were whispering, trying to figure out what had just happened. But I brushed off their questions, barely able to hold myself together. My appetite had vanished, and every second I sat there, pretending everything was fine, felt like a betrayal to my mom. The woman who'd always been there for me. Who loved my dad with her whole heart. Completely unaware of the lies he was living. The rest of the evening felt like a haze. My mind drifting back to that scene over and over. I barely heard what my friends were saying. My thoughts consumed by the sight of my dad holding another woman's hand. I felt torn between anger and sadness. Feeling like I just lost something I could never get back. The ride home the next day was tense. I didn't want to see my dad. But I had no choice. He kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. His expression unreadable. I knew he wanted to say something. But I refused to give him the chance. I didn't owe him anything. Especially not a moment to justify his actions. He had crossed a line. A line I couldn't unsee. All I could think about was my mom. And how much she trusted him. I couldn't understand how he could betray her so easily. As if our family didn't mean anything. A part of me wanted to scream. To ask him how he could do this to us. But instead, I sat there in silence. Staring out the window. Feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on me. By the time we got home, I was numb. Too drained to even think. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep this a secret. I didn't know how or when. But eventually, I'd have to tell my mom. She deserved to know the truth. Even if it shattered everything. When I got home from that trip, everything felt different. My house, usually a place of comfort, felt like a lie. A set piece in a show I didn't want to be a part of. I walked through the door with my bag, barely registering my mom's warm smile and hug. Her embrace felt so genuine. Her love so effortless. And it made the knot in my stomach twist even tighter. She had no idea. And for the first time in my life, I had to hide something from her. Something big. My mom always knew when something was off with me. So I tried to keep things normal. But it felt impossible. That first night back, sitting down for dinner felt like trying to pretend I wasn't living in some stranger's house. My dad sat across from me. Quiet but visibly tense. His eyes avoided mine. But every so often, I'd catch him glancing at me. Like he was testing to see if I'd say something or make a scene. My mom, oblivious, was happy to have us all home. Talking about the week's plans. Asking about my trip. And sharing little updates about work and life. She went on about the garden she'd been working on. Telling us about new flowers she wanted to plant. The whole time, I felt like I was choking. Like I could barely breathe under the weight of everything I knew but couldn't say. Each word she spoke, every little detail she shared about her week, only made the guilt worse. Here was my mom, the same loving woman who'd raised me. Who'd been there for every scraped knee and every tear. Sharing her life with us. Completely unaware of the secrets her husband was keeping. And now I was keeping one, too. I was torn between anger and sadness. Wanting to shield her from the truth but knowing that keeping this from her would make me complicit in my dad's lie. After dinner, I excused myself, claiming I was tired from the trip. As soon as I was in my room, I shut the door and leaned against it, letting out the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My mind replayed the scene at the restaurant, over and over, until it felt like I was torturing myself with it. Every detail was burned into my memory. The way he'd held the other woman's hand. The look on his face. The way he tried to brush it off like it was nothing. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do something that would let out the anger and confusion boiling inside me. But I couldn't. If I cried, someone would hear me. If I confronted my dad, he'd make excuses or, worse, try to manipulate me into silence. And I knew, deep down, that if I told my mom, it would break her heart. The kind of hurt that never really goes away. The days that followed were agonizing. My dad barely spoke to me, acting as though everything was normal. While I tried to avoid him as much as possible, I stayed in my room more than usual. And every time I heard his voice echo down the hallway, I felt a wave of anger rise in me. I hated that he was acting so casual, as though he hadn't done anything wrong, as if I could just let this slide. But I couldn't. I was furious with him, and I couldn't ignore the sense of betrayal gnawing at me. I wanted answers. No. I needed answers. I needed to know why he'd do something like this. How he could betray my mom and lie to her face every day. But every time I considered asking him, fear held me back. What if he tried to brush me off again? What if he made it sound like I was overreacting? Like this was somehow my fault? There were moments when I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe he was telling the truth when he said it was complicated. But I couldn't forget the way they'd looked at each other. The way that woman had touched his arm. And the way he hadn't pulled away. I might be young, but I wasn't naive. I knew what I'd seen. And I knew he was lying. The guilt of keeping this secret ate away at me. And every time I saw my mom, it got worse. She was her usual cheerful self, going about her days with no idea of the storm building just out of sight. She'd talk to me about her plans for the weekend, mention things she and my dad were planning together. And each time, I felt a pang of anger mixed with sadness. She didn't deserve this. She deserved the truth, no matter how much it would hurt. But telling her, I couldn't bring myself to do it. What if it destroyed everything? What if it tore our family apart? And my dad never took responsibility? Would it be worth it if the outcome was only pain? These questions haunted me, filling every quiet moment with a gnawing anxiety that wouldn't let up. One night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every possible scenario in my mind. I imagined telling my mom, seeing her face fall as the reality hit her. I pictured the look of betrayal in her eyes, the pain that would cut deeper than anything else. I imagined my dad denying it, making excuses, or worse, trying to manipulate the situation to make himself look like the victim. And in every version of the scenario, I was left feeling hollow, unsure if any of it would actually bring any peace. But there was one thing I couldn't shake, the feeling that by staying silent, I was allowing my dad's actions to go unchecked, like I was somehow enabling him. I kept going back and forth, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger, guilt, and fear. Every choice felt like it would lead to something painful, something that couldn't be taken back. In the end, I decided to stay quiet, at least for the time being. I told myself it was just until I figured out the right thing to do. But deep down, I knew I was stalling. I didn't want to be the one to pull the pin on this grenade. To be the one to set off a chain reaction that would shatter my family. But even as I tried to bury it, the secret hung between us, growing heavier each day. It was like a shadow following me around, lurking in every corner, turning even the most ordinary moments into painful reminders of what I knew and what I was hiding. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was betraying my mom just as much as my dad was. Each time I saw her smile or heard her laugh, the guilt twisted deeper. She trusted me, she loved me, and here I was, hiding something that could break her. The weight of that truth was suffocating. But so was the fear of what would happen if I finally spoke up. A few days after we got home, my dad cornered me in the kitchen, timing it perfectly for when my mom had gone out to run errands. I'd been hoping to avoid this conversation, dreading what he'd say. Part of me hoped he might apologize, explain himself, maybe even express a hint of remorse. But as he stood there, fidgeting with his keys and looking everywhere but at me, I realized that wasn't the case. Listen, he started, his voice barely above a whisper, like he was already trying to cover his tracks. About what you saw on the trip, I need you to keep this to yourself. I stared at him, feeling the anger begin to build. He wasn't here to own up to anything. He was here to silence me. I could feel a chill creep up my spine. And I crossed my arms, bracing myself. This kind of thing, he continued, as if choosing his words carefully. It's complicated. You wouldn't understand. Not at your age. I felt my jaw clench. There it was again. The same patronizing line he'd tried to pull back at the restaurant. I couldn't believe he was standing here, telling me this was something I wouldn't understand. That his choices were somehow beyond my comprehension. Look, he said, lowering his voice even more, as if sharing a secret. Sometimes, in a marriage, there are things that happen, things that don't mean what they look like. You're too young to understand how complicated adult relationships can be. The way he kept saying, complicated, felt like a slap in the face. He wasn't even willing to admit what he was doing, hiding behind these vague excuses that only made him sound more guilty. Every part of me wanted to scream at him, to tell him I understood plenty, that I wasn't stupid or naive. But I kept my mouth shut, letting him dig his own grave as he tried to twist his actions into something justifiable. What would telling your mom accomplish? Really? He asked, his voice almost pleading now. You'd just cause her unnecessary pain. And for what? Something you don't even fully understand? I felt my hands start to shake, the anger boiling up inside me. But I forced myself to stay still. Something I don't understand? I wanted to shout. I understand betrayal just fine. I understand how wrong this is. But I bit my tongue, too hurt and too furious to even trust myself to speak. My dad took my silence as agreement. Or maybe just as a sign of surrender. I know this might be hard for you. But we're a family, and you need to think about that before doing anything rash. He put a hand on my shoulder. A gesture that used to feel comforting but now felt manipulative. A way to enforce his position and make me feel small. His eyes met mine. A silent plea that I stay silent. That I become a willing participant in his lie. It would ruin everything. He added softly. All of the happiness. The stability. Is that what you want? There was no way to respond to that. He was turning it all back on me. Painting this choice as a burden I had to bear for the sake of the family. The irony of it struck me hard. He was the one who had done something wrong. And yet here he was, asking me to protect him, to keep his secret, to help him hide the truth from the person he was supposed to love. Without another word, I pulled away from him, ignoring the look of disappointment that flickered across his face. I could see he wanted me to feel guilty, to internalize the lie as something I could live with. But all I felt was disgust. I went to my room, slamming the door behind me, and sat on my bed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't believe that my dad was asking this of me, that he was so desperate to cover his tracks he'd drag me into his deception. He wasn't just betraying my mom, he was betraying me, too, by making me part of his lie. He was compromising the trust we'd had. And I knew that whatever relationship we'd once shared would never be the same. In the silence of my room, I felt the weight of what he'd asked press down on me. The guilt was suffocating, as if he'd transferred all the responsibility onto me, making it my duty to keep this secret or be the one to tear our family apart. He'd spun the entire situation so that if things fell apart, it would be my fault. I was too young to understand his actions, but apparently not too young to carry the weight of his lies. As the days went by, the memory of our conversation lingered like a bitter aftertaste. My dad's words played over and over in my head, filling me with resentment and anger every time I thought about them. I felt trapped, caught between his insistence that I stay quiet and my own moral compass telling me this wasn't right. My mom deserved to know. Yet every time I pictured telling her, I heard my dad's voice echoing, "It would ruin everything. Is that what you want?" I knew I'd done nothing wrong, but his manipulation made me feel like I was somehow complicit in his actions. That by staying silent, I was enabling him, allowing him to continue as if nothing had happened. Each day, the burden grew heavier, the guilt gnawing away at me until it felt like I was being consumed from the inside. And then there was my mom. Every time I saw her, I felt the secret festering inside me, like a thorn lodged too deep to remove. She'd ask me about my day, chat about plans for the weekend, share little details about her own life. And every time, the guilt surged, a reminder of the lie I was living by not telling her the truth. Once, while we were folding laundry together, she looked at me, a hint of worry in her eyes. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her voice gentle. "Is everything okay?" I wanted to tell her everything right then and there. I wanted to tell her how much I hated this secret. How much I hated that my dad was asking me to protect him when he'd done nothing to earn it. But the words wouldn't come. I knew that telling her would shatter her. And even though I was angry, I couldn't bring myself to be the one to break her heart. It's just school stuff, I said, forcing a small smile. Senior year stress, I guess. She nodded, accepting the excuse with a soft smile. And I felt my chest tighten. I wanted so desperately to protect her. But I also knew that staying quiet was only feeding my dad's lies, making me a silent accomplice in his betrayal. The days blurred together in a haze of guilt and resentment. I went through the motions, doing my best to avoid my dad and keep up appearances with my mom. But inside, I was drowning, the weight of the secret growing heavier with each passing day. It was like carrying a shadow, an invisible burden that clung to me, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. Something would have to give. And sooner or later, I'd have to make a choice. Either I'd keep my dad's secret, letting the guilt continue to eat away at me, or I'd tell my mom, knowing full well that the fallout could tear our family apart. But for now, I was trapped, caught in the space between loyalty and betrayal, between my love for my mom and the pressure my dad had placed on me. And with each passing day, the choice felt harder, the burden heavier, and the guilt more consuming than ever. The days after my dad's plea to stay silent felt like a balancing act on a crumbling bridge. Every moment at home became a test of my patience, a strain on my self-control as I fought to keep the anger simmering inside me from spilling over. I wanted to scream at him, confront him again, make him see the mess he'd created. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. He'd just twist it all back on me, make me feel like I was blowing things out of proportion. Instead, I found ways to distance myself. I stopped lingering around after dinner, making excuses to leave the table as soon as I could. I shut myself in my room whenever he was home, staying behind closed doors with music blasting through my headphones, trying to drown out my thoughts. I even volunteered to run errands for my mom just to avoid being around him, taking the long way home every time just to be out of the house a little longer. He must have noticed, but if he did, he didn't say a word. He probably assumed I'd stay silent, that I'd keep his secret out of some misplaced sense of duty. And that only made me angrier. How could he be so nonchalant, going about his days as though nothing had changed? It felt like he'd handed off his guilt to me and expected me to carry it for him, to be complicit in his lies just because he'd asked. Each time I saw him acting normal, it felt like a fresh betrayal, a reminder of how easily he could carry on, leaving me with the burden of his actions. My mom noticed, too. Of course, she's always been attuned to my moods, able to pick up on the slightest shift in my behavior. And now, with me avoiding dinner conversations and leaving the house more often, she could tell something was up. She'd ask if I was okay, her voice filled with genuine concern. And every time I'd lie, assuring her that I was just stressed or tired, I could see the worry in her eyes. And it killed me a little more each time. The secret between us hung there like a shadow, growing darker with each lie I told. One evening, when she asked me if something was wrong, I couldn't help the resentment that flashed through me. Here was my mom, kind and trusting, completely in the dark about what her husband was doing behind her back. She deserved to know, and every part of me wanted to tell her. But the fear of the fallout held me back. The uncertainty of what would happen if I finally broke the silence. The anger started to leak out in small ways, slipping through the cracks of my carefully controlled facade. I'd snap at my dad over trivial things, unable to keep the bitterness from creeping into my voice. When he'd try to make casual conversation with me, I'd cut him off, giving him one-word answers or walking away altogether. It was childish, maybe, but it was the only way I knew to keep from exploding. To show him, even in small ways, that I hadn't forgiven him and that I wouldn't just pretend like everything was fine. But each confrontation only seemed to widen the gulf between us. He never addressed it, never pulled me aside to ask what was wrong. Just let the tension build. Maybe he thought he could outlast my anger, that I'd eventually get tired of fighting and give in to his request. Or maybe he simply didn't care enough to address it. Either way, the silence between us became a wall, a constant reminder of the lie we were both living with. It was around this time that my mom's birthday rolled around, and she planned a small family dinner to celebrate. I dreaded it, the thought of sitting down at a table with both of them, pretending to be a happy family, made me feel sick, but I couldn't avoid it. Not without raising questions. So I put on a brave face, doing my best to smile and laugh, trying to make her day special despite the storm raging inside me. The evening was a blur. My focus split between keeping up appearances and avoiding any interaction with my dad. My mom beamed the whole night, her happiness so genuine that it almost made me feel guilty for not being fully present. Almost. Because every time I saw my dad smiling at her, my anger flared up again, reminding me of the truth I was hiding. He didn't deserve her love, and he didn't deserve the family he was betraying. At one point, my mom pulled me aside. Her face lit up with joy as she thanked me for helping with the evening. She hugged me, and I could feel the warmth in her embrace. The love she had for both me and my dad. Oblivious to the secret that could shatter it all. I hugged her back, trying to keep my voice steady as I told her I was happy to help. But the words felt hollow, empty in the face of everything I was hiding. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying the dinner over and over in my mind. The image of my dad laughing, my mom's face lighting up whenever he spoke, the little glances they exchanged, all of it felt like a twisted performance. A charade designed to keep the truth buried. And I was part of it, forced into the role of the silent bystander, watching it all unfold while holding onto a secret that wasn't even mine. The weight of it was unbearable, the anger building until it felt like I was suffocating. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. How much longer I could go on pretending everything was normal while knowing the truth. Each time I looked at my mom, the guilt tore at me. A reminder that I was betraying her just as much as my dad was. And each time I saw my dad, the resentment flared. A reminder of how he'd put me in this position, asking me to cover for him while he continued living his lie. But even as the anger and guilt consumed me, I couldn't bring myself to break the silence. I was trapped, torn between my love for my mom and the fear of what the truth would do to her. And so, I kept up the act, distancing myself from both of them, hoping that somehow, I'd find a way out of this mess without destroying the family we'd built. But deep down, I knew that was just wishful thinking. Sooner or later, something would have to give. And when it did, there'd be no going back. In the weeks following my dad's request, I found myself watching my mom more closely, looking for any signs that she sensed something was wrong. Part of me kept hoping that she'd pick up on it herself. That somehow she'd figure out what was going on so I wouldn't have to be the one to break the news. But every day, she went about her life, laughing with us, planning family meals, and talking about little weekend trips she wanted to take with my dad. She was so blissfully unaware of the truth, and it tore at me. It felt like I was seeing her through a new lens, one that exposed just how much she depended on the stability of our family. I started noticing the little things she did for us, the ways she kept our family together. Every morning, she'd wake up early, making breakfast and packing my dad's lunch. Even on the days she worked, she'd leave little notes in his bag. Things like, "Have a great day," or, "Looking forward to dinner tonight." It was so sweet, so genuine, and every note felt like another needle pricking my heart. I couldn't bear to imagine the devastation she'd feel if she knew what her husband was really doing. In a way, it felt cruel, like she was being set up for a heartbreak she didn't see coming. I started thinking back to my childhood, all the ways my mom had made life feel secure and safe. She'd always been the one to organize family game nights, to make holidays special, to remember every little milestone in my life. She was the rock, the person who made our house feel like home. And yet, she had no idea that this foundation she'd built so lovingly was on the verge of crumbling. One evening, I found myself looking through a photo album she kept on the living room shelf. It was filled with pictures of our family through the years, vacations, birthdays, random snapshots from lazy Sundays at home. There was one of my parents at a beach, holding hands and laughing, looking young and in love. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if the love they'd shared back then was still real, or if it had been eroded over the years, turning into whatever betrayal my dad was now living out. I'd always thought of my family as solid, unbreakable. My parents had seemed like the ideal couple, the kind that could weather any storm. But now, seeing these pictures, it felt like they were taunting me. reminding me of a happiness that no longer felt real. I wondered if my dad had ever looked at these photos. If he'd ever stopped to consider the life he was risking by lying to my mom, by putting himself first. Some nights, I'd sit in my room and listen to my parents talking in the next room. Their laughter muffled but warm. My mom's voice was always full of love, a brightness that had never dimmed. And my dad would respond in kind, playing the part of the devoted husband with a skill that sickened me. It was as if he'd compartmentalized his life, keeping his betrayal separate from the family he pretended to care about. The worst part was that I couldn't escape it. Even when I was out with friends or at school, I'd find myself thinking about the lie I was keeping, the way it shadowed every part of my life. My friends would talk about their families, about their parents and siblings, and I'd feel a sharp pang of envy. They didn't know what it was like to carry a secret this heavy. To live in a house where every smile felt forced, where every kind word felt like a betrayal. One Saturday, I went with my mom to run errands. Just the two of us. It was one of those rare days where we had time to talk. Really talk. As we drove, she told me about her week. Little things about work, about friends she'd seen, about a new recipe she wanted to try for us that weekend. Her voice was so full of warmth, so happy, and it took everything in me to keep from breaking down right then and there. At one point, she glanced over at me, her expression soft. "You've seemed a little quiet lately," she said gently. "I know senior year can be a lot. And I know I always say you can talk to me. But, you know you really can. Right?" Her words almost broke me. I wanted to tell her everything, to unload the guilt and anger that had been building up inside me. But the thought of seeing her smile fade, of shattering the peace she'd created, held me back. I nodded, giving her a small smile, and said, "Thanks, Mom. I'm just dealing with a lot right now. But I'm okay." She nodded, seeming to accept my answer, though I could tell she was still worried. She reached over, squeezing my hand briefly, and said, "Well, you're handling it with a lot of maturity. I'm proud of you. You know that?" Hearing her say those words cut deeper than I could have imagined. Here she was, proud of me, thinking I was becoming a responsible young adult. And I was lying to her face. I felt like an imposter. Like I was betraying her trust every time I smiled and pretended everything was fine. As the weeks wore on, I found myself trapped in a cycle of guilt and resentment, watching my mom live in blissful ignorance while I wrestled with the weight of the truth. She'd spend hours planning little things for us, family activities or dinners, things she thought would make us all happy. And each time, I'd find myself getting angrier, not at her, but at my dad, at the fact that he was letting her go on like this. Investing in a family he was tearing apart from the inside. One night, as we sat down for a family dinner, I looked at my mom across the table, noticing the small lines at the corners of her eyes, the smile that hadn't changed since I was a kid. She caught me staring and smiled back, laughing lightly. "What's that look for?" she teased. "I don't have something on my face. Do I?" I shook my head, forcing a laugh. "No, you're fine," I said, brushing it off. But inside, I felt like I was breaking. I couldn't help but think about how she was the only innocent person at that table. The only one who didn't know the lie she was living in. And I hated myself for not having the courage to tell her. For letting her sit there, happy and content, while I knew what was lurking beneath the surface. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how much my mom's happiness depended on a man who was betraying her trust. A man who'd pulled me into his lie without a second thought. I wondered if he'd ever really loved her, or if he'd just become so accustomed to the routine of marriage that he'd taken her for granted, seeing her as part of the background rather than as a person. The thought haunted me, twisting in my mind as I stared at the ceiling, feeling more alone than ever. I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending. How much longer I could watch my mom live in a world that was one truth away from crumbling. But the fear of shattering her happiness, of tearing apart the stability she'd worked so hard to build, held me back. It was like being stuck in a nightmare, trapped between the need to protect her and the guilt of hiding the truth. And as much as I wanted to believe that things would somehow work out, that my dad would come clean or that the situation would resolve itself, I knew deep down that was just wishful thinking. Eventually, I'd have to make a choice. But for now, all I could do was wait, trapped in a silent storm of anger, guilt, and fear, watching my mom's happiness from a distance, knowing that the truth was a time bomb ticking away, waiting for the moment it would explode. The longer I kept my dad's secret, the more unbearable the silence became. Every day felt like an uphill battle, a struggle to keep my anger and resentment in check while pretending that everything was normal. But the weight of it all was suffocating, and I knew I couldn't keep it inside much longer. The breaking point came one evening when my mom asked my dad about taking a weekend getaway. Just the two of them. Her face lit up as she spoke, her eyes filled with excitement, like she was planning a little escape for just the two of them, a chance to reconnect. She'd picked a cozy bed and breakfast in a small town a few hours away. A place she'd been talking about visiting for years. She looked at him expectantly, practically glowing with excitement as she waited for his response. But my dad barely looked up from his phone, muttering something vague about being too busy and having a lot going on at work. He didn't even glance at her, didn't acknowledge her effort or her excitement. He brushed her off without a second thought, like she was asking for a trivial favor instead of trying to plan something meaningful for their relationship. I could see the light in her eyes dim a little, the disappointment flickering across her face before she quickly covered it up, giving him a small smile and saying, "I understand, maybe some other time." It was a small moment, one that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But to me, it was infuriating. Here she was, trying to keep their relationship alive, pouring herself into this family, and he couldn't even give her the courtesy of looking up from his phone. And all I could think about was that other woman, the one he'd been so attentive to, the one he'd made time for when he was supposed to be working. The contrast was too much, and I felt something inside me snap. As soon as dinner ended, I went straight to my room, seething. I couldn't hold it in any longer, the anger was boiling over. Refusing to be contained, I paced around, replaying the moment over and over in my mind, feeling the resentment build until it felt like it was going to tear me apart. I knew I couldn't keep this up. Couldn't keep watching my dad lie and pretend while my mom poured everything into a relationship he was taking for granted. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I marched out of my room, catching my dad as he was heading to his office. Without a second thought, I grabbed his arm, pulling him into the hallway, away from where my mom could overhear us. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, but I didn't care. I had to confront him, had to make him understand the damage he was causing. He looked at me, surprised and a little annoyed, as if I'd interrupted something important. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone flat, indifferent. It only made me angrier. "You know exactly what this is about," I shot back, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You can sit there and act like nothing's wrong. But I know what you're doing. I saw you with her. I know you're lying to Mom, and I can't keep this secret for you anymore." His face paled, the mask of indifference slipping as he realized I wasn't backing down. "We've been over this," he said, his voice dropping to a low, defensive tone. "This isn't something you understand. It's complicated." I clenched my fists, the anger boiling over. "Stop saying that," I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "Stop pretending like this is something I can't understand. I understand perfectly fine. You're cheating on Mom, and you're asking me to keep it a secret. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" He looked away, a flash of guilt crossing his face before he quickly masked it with irritation. "This isn't about you," he said sharply, his tone taking on a harsh edge. "This is an adult matter. And you're a kid. You shouldn't be interfering in things you don't fully grasp." I felt a wave of frustration, a feeling of helplessness that only made me angrier. "I may be young, but I'm not stupid," I said, my voice filled with barely controlled fury. "I know what betrayal looks like. And I know what it's doing to our family. You're the one who put me in this position. And now you're telling me to just sit here and do nothing? How can you expect that?" He let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples as if I was the one giving him a headache. "Look," he said, his tone shifting, trying to sound reasonable. "These things aren't black and white. Relationships are complicated, and sometimes people drift apart. Drift apart? I echoed, disgusted by his attempt to minimize what he'd done. That's not drifting apart. You're lying to her, sneaking around behind her back. She deserves the truth, and you know it. She's trying so hard, and you're just throwing it all away like it doesn't matter. He looked at me, his expression a mix of anger and desperation, like he couldn't believe I was challenging him. Do you have any idea what you're saying? He asked, his voice shaking. Telling her would destroy her. It would ruin our family. Is that really what you want? The words stung, twisting in my chest like a knife. He was trying to make me feel guilty, trying to push the responsibility of his choices onto me, as if keeping his secret was some twisted way of preserving our family. But I wasn't the one who had betrayed my mom. I wasn't the one who had put everything at risk. I didn't put our family in this situation, I replied, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. You did. You made this choice, and you don't get to make me carry the weight of it. He stared at me, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, I thought he might actually acknowledge the damage he'd done, the hurt he'd caused, but instead, he just shook his head, his face hardening. You're too young to understand, he said, his tone dismissive, as if that was the final word on the matter. The anger surged up again, stronger than before, but this time, I didn't try to fight it. Stop saying that, I said, my voice shaking with fury. Stop pretending like I'm too young to see what's right in front of me. I'm not going to keep your secret. And I'm not going to be your cover. He took a step back, his expression darkening. You'll regret it if you say anything, he warned, his voice cold and final. This isn't something you can take back. If you tell her, you'll tear this family apart. The words hung in the air, the weight of his threat settling between us. I knew he was trying to scare me, to guilt me into silence. But I also knew that nothing he said could change the truth. I had tried to stay quiet, tried to keep his secret, but I couldn't do it anymore. This wasn't my burden to carry. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the hallway, his expression unreadable. I went back to my room, shutting the door behind me and letting out a shaky breath. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with everything I'd just said. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of relief. I knew the path I was about to take would be painful. And I had no idea how my mom would react, what this revelation would do to our family. But I also knew that I couldn't keep living in silence, pretending everything was fine while my dad continued to betray her trust. She deserved the truth, no matter how much it would hurt. And as I sat there, my resolve hardening, I knew that, whatever happened next, I'd made the right choice. After my confrontation with my dad, the secret I'd been keeping felt more unbearable than ever. The weight of it seemed to press down on me harder with each passing day, suffocating me with the guilt and anger I'd been holding back for so long. I needed to talk to someone, to release some of the tension. But I felt trapped in silence. I was terrified of what telling my mom would do, afraid of shattering her world, and uncertain if it would even help. But keeping it in felt just as destructive. After a restless night, I decided I couldn't carry this burden alone anymore. I texted my best friend, Mia, someone I'd known since we were kids. Mia had been through tough situations of her own and had always been my confidant. I knew if there was anyone I could trust, anyone who wouldn't judge me for the decisions I was facing, it was her. I asked if we could meet up, and she agreed without question, sensing from my message that something serious was weighing on me. We met at a small coffee shop near her house, the kind of place where no one asked questions and you could disappear into the crowd. As soon as I saw her, the knot in my chest loosened a little, but I still struggled to find the right words. She looked at me, her face full of quiet concern, waiting patiently as I gathered my thoughts. Finally, I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I began to explain everything, the trip, seeing my dad with another woman, the way he'd brushed it off, and how he'd cornered me, pleading for my silence. The words spilled out faster than I expected, tumbling over each other in a rush of pent-up frustration, hurt, and guilt. When I finished, I looked at her, waiting for her reaction, bracing myself for whatever judgment might come. But she didn't look shocked or judgmental. Instead, her face softened, and she reached out, giving my hand a comforting squeeze. "I'm so sorry you're going through this," she said quietly. That's an awful thing to be dealing with. Especially alone." Her kindness broke through the numbness I'd felt for weeks. And I could feel the tears start to well up. A sense of relief washing over me. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was drowning in the secret alone. "I just don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice shaky. "I feel like telling my mom is the right thing. But it would tear her apart. And I don't know if I can be the one to do that." Mia nodded, listening intently, not rushing me. "I can't tell you what to do," she said gently, "but I can tell you that whatever choice you make, it's not your fault. Your dad is the one who did this. You're not the one breaking up the family, he is." Her words sank in, reassuring and validating, and I realized how desperately I needed to hear them. I'd been carrying the guilt as if it were mine. But she was right. I hadn't created this mess. I was just caught in the middle of it, forced to choose between protecting my mom and keeping my dad's lie. Mia continued, "I get why you're scared of telling her. Though, it's not an easy choice. But if you do decide to tell her, you're not doing it to hurt her. You're doing it because she deserves the truth." The truth. It sounded so simple, but the implications were massive. A weighty responsibility I couldn't shake. But what if telling her just makes everything worse? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What if it doesn't help at all and just makes her miserable? Mia thought about it for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I think she has a right to make that choice for herself. Right now, your dad's taking that choice away from her. She thinks she's in a marriage where he's committed, where he's someone she can trust. But that's not true, and she's building her life on a lie. It's not fair to keep that from her, even if it's out of love." Her words resonated deeply, confirming something I'd been feeling all along but hadn't allowed myself to fully accept. I couldn't control my mom's reaction, couldn't protect her from the pain this truth would bring. But I could at least give her the agency to decide what to do with it. Still, the thought of being the one to deliver that news filled me with dread. "She'll be devastated, Mia," I said, my voice choked with emotion. "She loves him so much. I don't know if she'll be able to handle it." Mia gave my hand another squeeze, her voice full of empathy. "She's strong. I know it'll be hard. And she'll probably be heartbroken. But I think she'd rather know than live in the dark. And you don't have to go through it alone. I'm here, no matter what you decide." A sense of calm settled over me, a quiet strength that Mia's support seemed to bring out. Knowing she had my back made the idea of confronting my mom feel a little less daunting. I wasn't entirely alone in this. And that small comfort gave me the courage I'd been lacking. We spent the rest of the afternoon together, Mia listening patiently as I worked through my conflicting emotions. By the time I left, I felt more centered, more grounded. The conversation hadn't made my decision easier, but it had helped me see it more clearly. I understood now that keeping this secret wasn't sparing my mom, it was delaying an inevitable pain. A truth that would one day come out, whether from me or someone else. That night, lying in bed, I replayed our conversation in my head, feeling a sense of resolve start to form. I knew the choice I had to make, but the fear was still there, lingering at the edges, whispering doubts and uncertainties. I imagined sitting my mom down, telling her what I'd seen, watching the hurt flash across her face as she realized the truth. It was a terrifying image, one that left me feeling small and vulnerable, but also one that felt right. For the first time, I allowed myself to picture what might happen if I told her. Maybe there would be anger, grief, tears, all the things I'd feared. But there would also be honesty, a chance for my mom to make her own decisions, to confront the betrayal and decide what she wanted for herself. Keeping the secret might keep our family intact on the surface, but it was a fragile piece, one built on lies and false pretenses. Telling the truth might destroy that illusion, but it would also give her the power to rebuild her life however she chose. As the hours passed, I felt my resolve solidify. I knew there was no easy outcome, no solution that wouldn't hurt someone. But in the end, I realized that sparing my mom's feelings in the short term would only cause her more pain in the long run. Mia was right. She deserved the truth. And it wasn't my job to protect her from it. The next day, I texted Mia, letting her know what I decided. She sent back a simple, "I'm proud of you," and I could feel her support radiating through the words. Steadying me. I wasn't sure when I'd tell my mom or how I'd find the right words. But I knew I'd do it soon. I had to. In the meantime, I focused on keeping my mind clear, finding strength in the decision I'd made. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it didn't hold the same power over me as before. I was ready, or at least as ready as I'd ever be, to face the consequences of the truth. As the days went by, I braced myself for what lay ahead, finding solace in the knowledge that I wasn't alone. Mia's words echoed in my mind, a steady reminder that I was doing the right thing, no matter how painful it might be. The truth was heavy, yes, but it was also freeing. And with that newfound clarity, I prepared myself to finally, painfully, set it free. After my conversation with Mia, I thought I'd feel more at peace. Like the decision would sit easier now that I knew what I needed to do. But the days leading up to it turned out to be some of the hardest I'd ever experienced. Every time I looked at my mom, every time I saw her smile at my dad or laugh at something he said, the guilt twisted deeper. I felt like I was watching a play, a carefully staged performance where I was the only one who knew the script was a lie. The hardest part was pretending that everything was normal, playing the role of the happy, innocent daughter when my mind was consumed by what I knew. Each morning, I'd wake up determined to talk to my mom, convinced that I'd find the right time, the right words, but every evening, I'd find myself holding back, unsure of how to bring it up, afraid of the pain that would inevitably follow. One evening, we were all in the living room, the three of us curled up on the couch watching a movie. My mom sat in the middle, holding a bowl of popcorn, completely absorbed in the film. My dad sat beside her, his arm draped over her shoulders, looking for all the world like a man who adored his wife. Watching them like that, you'd never guess there was anything wrong. It felt surreal, like I was watching a version of my family that only existed on the surface. Every now and then, my mom would lean into him, smiling up at him with that same look of warmth and love she'd always had. And my dad would smile back, laughing at her comments or pretending to be interested in the little things she pointed out. It was so convincing, I almost wanted to believe it was real. But every time I felt that flicker of hope, the memory of what I'd seen resurfaced. A reminder that this closeness was just a facade, a carefully crafted illusion that he was using to keep us all in the dark. I wanted to scream, to shout the truth and break the silence that had settled over our family like a shroud. It felt wrong, sitting there and pretending, letting my mom bask in the happiness she thought was real. I knew that every second I stayed quiet, I was letting her live in a lie. And I hated myself for it. But each time I opened my mouth to speak, the words caught in my throat, the enormity of what I was about to do freezing me in place. The next day, my mom and I spent the afternoon baking together. She'd been talking about making homemade cookies for a while, and I'd finally agreed to help her. As we stood side by side in the kitchen, mixing ingredients and laughing over the mess we were making, the guilt was nearly unbearable. She was so happy, chatting about the upcoming holidays, telling me how excited she was to decorate the house together and make it feel cozy for winter. Her excitement was contagious, and for a moment, I let myself get caught up in it, laughing with her, pretending that we were just a mother and daughter, sharing a simple afternoon. But as we pulled the cookies out of the oven, I saw the look on her face, the pure joy in her eyes, and the guilt washed over me like a wave, a reminder that I was standing here, pretending, while knowing a truth that would shatter her. As she placed the cookies on the cooling rack, she turned to me with a warm smile. "I'm so glad we're doing this together," she said, her voice full of affection. "It feels like we haven't had much time, just the two of us, lately." I forced a smile, feeling the weight of her words settle on my shoulders. "Yeah, it's nice," I replied, my voice sounding hollow even to myself. She didn't notice. She was too busy arranging the cookies, humming to herself as if nothing in the world could touch her happiness. It was moments like this that made the secret feel like a poison, eating away at me, turning every interaction into a painful reminder of what I was keeping from her. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd looked at my dad. The trust and love in her eyes. She had no idea that he'd betrayed her. No idea that the man she'd devoted her life to had broken the vows he'd promised to keep. I felt like I was betraying her, too, letting her continue loving him without knowing the truth. The next day, things only got worse. I'd resolved to tell her that evening, promising myself that I'd finally break the silence, no matter how hard it was. But as the day went on, I found myself watching them again, studying the little moments between them, the way they'd exchange glances across the room, the way my mom would laugh at his jokes, the way he'd squeeze her hand like nothing was wrong. Every time I watched them, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. How could he act so normal, so loving, when I knew what he'd done? How could he sit there, laughing with her, pretending that everything was fine, when he was the one who'd created this mess in the first place? His calmness only fueled my anger, a steady flame that burned hotter every time I saw them together. It was like he'd trained himself to believe the lie, to compartmentalize his life in a way that made it easy to pretend, to put on a mask and act like he was still the husband my mom thought he was. And every time he did it, every time he smiled at her or wrapped his arm around her, it felt like another betrayal, a fresh wound that cut deeper than the last. That evening, as we all sat down for dinner, I felt the tension building again, the silence between us thick with the words I was afraid to say. My dad was his usual cheerful self, cracking jokes and talking about work, filling the room with his easy, casual charm, and my mom laughed along, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. At one point, she looked at me, noticing my silence. "You're quiet tonight," she remarked, her eyes full of concern. "Is everything okay?" I felt my chest tighten, the words on the tip of my tongue, ready to spill out. This was the moment I'd been dreading. The moment when I'd finally have to say it, to tell her the truth that would change everything. But as I looked into her eyes, the love and worry written so plainly on her face, the fear took hold again, freezing me in place. "Yeah," I mumbled, forcing a small smile. "I'm just tired." She nodded, accepting the excuse, but I could see the lingering worry in her gaze. It felt like I was breaking her trust every time I stayed silent, every time I held back the truth. But the thought of actually saying the words, of watching her face crumble as she realized what my dad had done, was too much to bear. After dinner, I went to my room, my heart pounding as I closed the door behind me. I sat on my bed, staring at the floor, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. The struggle was tearing me apart, each day bringing me closer to the breaking point. I couldn't keep this up forever. Couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. But the fear of what would happen if I finally told her was paralyzing. The next few days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next as I wrestled with the choice before me. I knew I couldn't keep this secret forever. That sooner or later, the truth would come out, whether I was the one to reveal it or not. But every time I thought about telling her, the fear and guilt crept in, holding me back, whispering that I was about to destroy everything she loved. In the end, I realized there was no perfect moment, no easy way to break the news. The longer I waited, the harder it became, the guilt and anger eating away at me, turning every interaction with my parents into a painful reminder of the truth I was hiding. And as I lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling, I knew that the time was coming, that I'd have to face the truth head on, no matter how much it hurt. The struggle to keep the secret had reached its limit. And I knew that I couldn't keep living in silence. The truth was waiting, and it wouldn't be ignored much longer. I don't know if it was one thing or a collection of things that finally pushed me over the edge. Maybe it was the countless little moments where I saw my mom's love for my dad, shining through in everything she did, every smile and touch. Maybe it was the guilt that had taken root inside me, growing heavier each day, reminding me that by staying silent, I was helping him betray her. Or maybe I'd just reached my breaking point, unable to keep pretending while the truth sat like a stone in my chest. Whatever it was, one evening, I knew it was time. I couldn't wait any longer. I sat in my room, rehearsing what I would say, trying to find the right words, the ones that would somehow make this easier. But there weren't any. No matter how I phrased it, the truth would hurt, would break her heart and shatter the world she thought she knew. I'd accepted that there was no way to do this without causing pain. No way to protect her from what was coming. All I could do was tell her honestly, hoping she'd see that I was doing it out of love, even if it felt like betrayal. I found her in the living room, sorting through a pile of old family photos. She looked up when I walked in, giving me a warm smile, the kind she'd always reserved just for me. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft. "Come look at these with me. I found some great ones from when you were little." Her excitement, her contentment, it was all so genuine, so blissfully unaware. Seeing her like that made it harder. But it also strengthened my resolve. She deserved the truth. She deserved to know what kind of man my dad really was. No matter how much it would hurt. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding as I sat down beside her. She looked at me, sensing the change in my demeanor, the seriousness in my expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, her smile fading, replaced by a look of concern. This was it. There was no turning back. I steadied myself, meeting her gaze, and said the words I'd been holding back for so long. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you. Something that I saw. And it's about Dad." Her face shifted, her brows knitting together in worry. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I took another deep breath, feeling my hands tremble as I spoke. "When I was on that trip a few weeks ago, I saw Dad with someone else. A woman. They were together, holding hands, laughing. It wasn't just a business meeting. They looked like more than friends." Her face went blank, her expression one of stunned disbelief. It was like she couldn't process what I was saying. Like she couldn't make sense of it. For a moment, she just stared at me, her eyes wide, her lips parted in shock. "Are you sure?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. "Are you absolutely sure, sweetheart?" I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. I confronted him about it. He didn't deny it. He just asked me not to tell you. He said it was complicated. I couldn't bring myself to say the rest. To tell her the way he'd tried to manipulate me into silence. To make me feel like I was the one at fault. She covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders trembling as she tried to hold back tears. Her expression was a mixture of shock, betrayal, and unbearable sadness. I wanted to reach out, to hold her, to tell her that it would be okay. But I knew it wouldn't be. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a hug or comforting words. It was a wound that would take a long time to heal. If it ever did. For a long time, she just sat there, her gaze fixed on the floor, lost in thought. I could see the pain written across her face, the way her hands clenched and unclenched, as though she were trying to process the enormity of what I'd told her. She looked like someone who'd just been told their entire life was a lie. And in a way, she had. The love and trust she'd built her life on had been broken. And there was no going back. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears, her voice shaking. "Thank you for telling me," she whispered, her voice so soft, so fragile. "I can't imagine how hard this was for you. But thank you for trusting me." Her gratitude caught me off guard, filling me with a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. I'd been so afraid that she'd blame me, that she'd see me as the one who'd broken our family apart. But instead, she held my hand, her grip firm, as though drawing strength from me. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. She went to her room, closing the door softly behind her, and I could hear the faint sound of her crying through the walls. It was a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. A reminder of the pain my dad's betrayal had caused, of the innocence that had been shattered. My dad came home later that night, his usual cheerful self, completely unaware of the storm waiting for him. I stayed in my room, my heart pounding as I heard the murmurs of conversation, the silence that followed as my mom told him what she knew. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the weight of them, the way they carried through the walls, filling the house with a tension that felt suffocating. A while later, I heard the sound of my dad's footsteps retreating, the door to their bedroom closing with a heavy finality. The house fell silent, the air thick with the fallout of the truth I'd revealed. I knew that things would never be the same, that our family had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But as painful as it was, I also felt a strange sense of relief. A weight lifting from my chest as I lay there, knowing that the secret was no longer mine to bear alone. The days that followed were quiet, tense, as my parents navigated the aftermath of the truth. My dad stayed in the guest room, barely speaking to me or my mom, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a stony silence. My mom moved through the house like a ghost, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She didn't talk about it, didn't ask me for details or try to discuss what had happened. But I could see the toll it was taking on her, the way it had shaken her to her core. I felt the guilt return, a nagging sense of responsibility for the pain she was going through. Even though I knew it wasn't my fault, I'd told her the truth because she deserved it, because she had the right to know. But watching her suffer, seeing the way it had broken her spirit, made me question if I'd done the right thing. One afternoon, as we sat together in the kitchen, she reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. "I know this has been hard on you, too," she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with understanding. "I want you to know that I'm grateful. You didn't do anything wrong. You were brave." Her words brought tears to my eyes, a wave of relief washing over me. She didn't blame me, she didn't see me as the one who'd ruined our family. And in that moment, I realized that telling her had been the right choice. That giving her the truth was the only way forward, even if it had hurt. The days turned into weeks, and life slowly began to find a new rhythm, one defined by silence and distance, by the void left in the wake of my dad's betrayal. My mom and I leaned on each other, drawing strength from our shared pain, finding a new kind of closeness that felt both comforting and bittersweet. We were a family redefined, a family reshaped by truth, navigating the fallout together. And as hard as it was, as painful as the decision had been, I knew I'd done the right thing. The weeks following my confession to my mom felt like walking through a fog, each day blending into the next, coated in a strange quietness. Life at home had changed irreversibly. My mom and I found our own rhythm, a new bond that grew out of our shared pain. But it was built on shaky ground. There was a vulnerability between us that hadn't existed before, and it felt raw, delicate, like it could fall apart with a single misstep. My dad, on the other hand, moved through the house like a shadow, his once cheerful presence replaced by silence. I could barely stand to look at him, barely able to process how he'd expected me to keep his secret, how he'd put the responsibility of protecting his image on my shoulders. I knew I wasn't the one who had broken our family, but his betrayal had left a mark on me, a scar that felt like it would be there forever. Over time, my mom and I began talking about the past, looking at it with new eyes, realizing that there had been signs of my dad's distance that we hadn't seen, or maybe hadn't wanted to see. She confided in me that she'd sensed things weren't perfect, that there had been subtle shifts in his behavior, but she'd dismissed them, chalking it up to stress, to work, to the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. Knowing this broke my heart all over again, as I realized how much she'd sacrificed, how much she'd overlooked for the sake of keeping our family together. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, she reached over, taking my hand. "You've shown me a lot of courage," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't expect this from you. I don't think I could have done the same if I'd been in your shoes." Her words humbled me, filling me with a strange mix of pride and sadness. I hadn't felt brave. If anything, I'd felt cornered, forced to confront a truth I'd never wanted to know, let alone reveal. But hearing her gratitude, her admiration, helped me understand that sometimes, courage isn't about feeling strong. It's about doing the right thing, even when it feels impossible. As the days turned into months, my mom and I began to build something new together. It wasn't easy. The house felt emptier, the silence heavier, and there were moments when I'd catch her looking at old photos, a faraway look in her eyes. But she was healing, slowly, finding her footing in a world where the foundation she'd once relied on was gone. She started focusing on herself more, taking up hobbies she'd long set aside, and even reconnecting with old friends. There was a new resilience in her, a quiet strength that filled me with both admiration and relief. For me, the journey was more internal. I had to reconcile my feelings, come to terms with the anger, the guilt, and the sense of betrayal that lingered. There were days when I questioned everything, wondering if I could have handled things differently, if I could have found a way to keep our family whole without revealing the truth. But as time went on, I realized that the truth had always been inevitable. My silence wouldn't have saved us, it would have only prolonged the lie. The illusion we'd all been living in. I found myself spending more time alone, processing everything that had happened, learning to accept the way my life had changed. I took up journaling, filling pages with my thoughts, my anger, my pain. It became a place where I could release the emotions I'd been carrying. A way to find clarity in the midst of the turmoil. Through it all, Mia remained by my side. She listened patiently whenever I needed to talk, offering advice or sometimes just a quiet presence that let me know I wasn't alone. I didn't have to carry the burden by myself anymore, and her support became an anchor. A reminder that even though my family had been shaken, there were still people in my life I could trust. One afternoon, months after everything had happened, Mia and I went for a walk, talking about the changes we'd both been through. She looked at me, her expression thoughtful, and said, "You know, you're different now, stronger, somehow. I don't know if you see it, but I do." Her words struck me, echoing something I'd felt but hadn't fully acknowledged. I had changed. This experience had forced me to grow in ways I hadn't expected. To face fears I hadn't even known I had. It hadn't been easy, and there were still days when I felt like I was walking through the ruins of my old life. But I was learning to find my own strength, my own resilience. I wasn't the same person I'd been before, but maybe that was okay. Maybe this version of myself was someone I could be proud of. Someone who could face the challenges ahead with a little more courage, a little more clarity. Eventually, my dad moved out. It was a quiet departure. No dramatic scenes or final conversations. My mom and I helped him pack, saying our goodbyes with a kind of distant politeness that masked the hurt we both felt. He apologized to me, his voice thick with regret. But I didn't respond. I didn't have the words. And I wasn't sure I wanted to forgive him. Not yet. As he drove away, I felt a strange sense of finality. A closing of a chapter that had been filled with both love and betrayal. It was painful, yes, but it was also freeing. I knew that our family would never be the same. But I also knew that I could finally begin to let go. To start rebuilding in my own way. In the months that followed, my mom and I created new routines, new traditions. The house became our own space. A place where we could laugh, cry, and be ourselves without the shadow of secrets hanging over us. We'd sit together on the porch in the evenings, sharing quiet conversations, finding comfort in each other's company. It wasn't perfect, and the pain still lingered, but there was a lightness to our lives that hadn't been there before. The weight of the lie was gone, and in its place was a chance to start over. Looking back, I could see how much I'd grown, how much strength I'd found in facing the truth. In standing up for what I believed was right. I'd faced one of the hardest choices of my life. And though it had left scars, it had also given me a sense of purpose. A sense of self that I hadn't had before. I was no longer just the daughter who had watched her family fall apart. I was someone who had survived it. Who had come out the other side with a new understanding of who I was and what I valued. In the end, the truth had been painful. But it had also been freeing. It had given my mom and me the chance to rebuild, to find our own path forward. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I knew we'd face it together, stronger and more resilient than before. As I looked out at the world, I felt a new sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of the past and a hope for the future. Life would go on, and so would we, building a new reality, one grounded in honesty, strength, and the unbreakable bond we'd forged through everything we'd been through. In the quiet of those evenings, sitting with my mom, watching the sunset cast warm colors over the horizon, I felt a sense of closure. A sense that maybe, just maybe, we'd be okay. And as the last traces of the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew that whatever came next, we'd face it together, one step at a time.